You can look, but don't touch. The security guard's words hung in the air as the old man's weathered fingers hovered inches from the sunburst Gibson. 60 years ago, those same fingers had made that very guitar weep during the recording of Midnight Requiem, the song that defined a generation. Now, behind velvet ropes and display glass, the instrument carried a price tag larger than everything he'd ever owned combined. The room full of tuxedos and diamonds shifted uncomfortably, champagne glasses pausing midway to lips. In the corner, a man in a simple black jacket watched, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. The grand pavilion glittered with chandeliers and wealth, each display case housing instruments worth millions. The Golden Era collection, read the brochure, 15 vintage guitars that had shaped modern music, now investment pieces for people who'd never play a note. Harold Matthews, 78, and dressed in his only good suit, had taken 3 buses to get here. His invitation had come after weeks of pleading with the organizers, just to see her again, he'd said. The '59 Les Paul that had been his voice when words failed him, the guitar he'd sold in '83 to pay for his wife's cancer treatments. The security guard's hand was now on Harold's shoulder, gently but firmly pulling him back as whispers rippled through the crowd. "Sir, these instruments are worth more than most homes," explained Marcus Whittington, the exhibition curator, his British accent polished to a sheen that matched his Italian shoes. "The current owner paid $2.3 million for this particular piece." Harold's eyes never left the guitar. "I paid for it with my soul," he whispered, too quietly for anyone but the security guard to hear. The crowd had already begun to shift away, embarrassed by this intrusion of humanity into their evening of acquisition. Only the man in the corner remained focused on the scene, his expression shifting from curiosity to something else entirely. Johnny Depp set his untouched champagne on a passing tray and began moving through the crowd. Harold Matthews stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze from the guitar. The security guard's grip had tightened, ready to escort him out if necessary. Every eye in the room seemed to burn into his back, the uninvited guest, the discordant note in this symphony of wealth. Decades ago, critics had called him the poet of 6 strings. Now he was just an old man in a room where he didn't belong. The guitar behind the glass had traveled with him through smoky bars and concert halls, had been there the night he met Claire, had recorded the songs that people still hum today. Each scratch on its surface told a story. The cigarette burn from that night in Memphis, the worn spot where his wedding ring had rubbed against the wood for 20 years. But those stories weren't listed on the placard beside it. The display simply read, 1959, Gibson, Les Paul Standard, Sunburst. Previous owners include Harold Matthews, 1966 to 1983. Current value, $2,300,000. "I believe the gentleman was just leaving," Marcus Whittington announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Several guests nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and disdain. A woman in diamonds worth a small fortune leaned toward her companion. "How did he even get in?" she whispered, not quite quietly enough. Harold felt heat rising in his face. He hadn't come to make a scene. He just wanted to see her one more time, maybe feel the weight of her in his hands. His doctor had given him 6 months, maybe less. 6 months to tie up the loose ends of a life spent in service to music rather than money. "That guitar has my blood in its grain," Harold said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Not literally, of course," he added, with a sad smile, "though there were nights my fingers bled enough for it." The security guard looked uncomfortable now, caught between protocol and the unmistakable dignity in the old musician's bearing. A few phone cameras had appeared, sensing drama worthy of social media. Marcus stepped forward, positioning himself between Harold and the display case. "While we appreciate your connection to the instrument, this is a private event for serious collectors and investors. His smile was tight, professional. Perhaps you'd enjoy the public viewing tomorrow? There's a lovely exhibit on music history at the City Museum as well. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Harold's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. The fight was leaving him. It had been leaving him by degrees for years. A voice cut through the tension, its distinctive cadence immediately recognizable. Serious collectors, huh? Johnny Depp had materialized beside Harold, his presence creating an immediate shift in the room's energy. Phones were raised higher now, the wealthy guests suddenly transformed into fans. Marcus's expression morphed from annoyance to professional delight. "Mr. Depp, we had no idea you'd honor us with your presence tonight. Are you interested in adding to your collection?" Johnny ignored him, focusing instead on Harold. "You're Harold Matthews, aren't you? The Harold Matthews?" The old man blinked in surprise. "You know who I am? Know who you are?" Johnny's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Man, Midnight Requiem got me through some of the darkest days of my life. That solo," he gestured toward the guitar in the case, "that solo on that very guitar is why I picked up playing in the first place." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests were frantically Googling Harold's name, others pretending they'd recognized him all along. The curator's expression flickered between confusion and damage control. Harold stood straighter now, warmth returning to his weathered face. Johnny turned to address the room, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of confidence and humility that had endeared him to millions. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the presence of greatness tonight, and I'm not talking about these guitars." He placed a gentle hand on Harold's shoulder. "This man made history with that instrument. While we're all here admiring the monetary value of these guitars, he actually made them valuable in the first place." The security guard had backed away, unsure of protocol, when one guest was defending another. Marcus stepped forward, his professional smile strained. "Of course, Mr. Matthews's contribution to music history is significant. That's precisely why his former instrument commands such a price today." He gestured to the display. "But surely you understand the need to protect these investments." "Investments," Johnny repeated, the word hanging in the air. "You know what's funny about that? I've collected guitars my whole life, never once thought of them as investments." He glanced around the room, taking in the display cases, the security, the guests in their finery. These instruments were built to be played. That's their purpose, their soul. The woman in diamonds scoffed quietly. "If you're so concerned, why don't you buy it for him?" she suggested with a dismissive wave of her hand. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Johnny, who laughed softly. "I would, gladly. But that's not the point." He turned back to Harold. "Tell them about that night in Berlin, '72, the one you mentioned in that interview with Rolling Stone." Harold's eyes widened slightly. "You read that?" Johnny nodded. "Every word." The old musician took a deep breath, his gaze returning to the guitar. "We were playing this underground club. The wall was still up then. East German kids would risk everything to sneak over for a night of rock and roll." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, years seeming to fall away. "Halfway through our set, the power went out. Complete darkness. People started to panic. So I found a chair, climbed on it, and played that guitar." He pointed to the Les Paul, "unplugged, just acoustic. The whole place went silent. I played until my fingers couldn't take it anymore. When I finished, a young man came up to me in tears, said it was the first time he'd felt free in his entire life." The room had grown still. Even Marcus seemed momentarily entranced by Harold's story. Johnny watched the faces of the guests, noting how they'd shifted from annoyance to attention. "That's what these instruments are for," he said quietly. "Not to sit behind glass, but to change lives." An older gentleman in a bespoke suit cleared his throat. "Mr. Depp, while the sentiment is admirable, The current owner paid a considerable sum for that particular guitar. It's now an appreciating asset. Johnny turned to him. And who is the current owner? Is he here tonight? Marcus interjected smoothly. The owner prefers to remain anonymous, as is common in high-value collections. Convenient, Johnny remarked. He addressed the room again. Let me ask all of you something. How many of you own guitars you've never played? How many of you know the difference between a Les Paul and a Stratocaster beyond their investment potential? Uncomfortable glances were exchanged. A few phones had lowered, their owners suddenly self-conscious about documenting this unexpected confrontation. Harold spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. I'm not asking to keep it. I'm dying, you see. Cancer. The bluntness of his statement sent a shock through the room. I just wanted to hold her one more time, to say goodbye properly. Johnny's expression darkened. He stepped closer to Marcus, his voice low but intense. You're telling me that this man, who made history with that guitar, who's responsible for its value in the first place, can't even touch it one last time before he dies? Marcus swallowed hard. It's not up to me. There are insurance considerations, security protocols. Johnny cut him off. Then get on the phone. Call whoever you need to call, because this... He gestured around the room. This is not how we honor the people who created the music we claim to value. Marcus retreated to a corner, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing emphatically. The exhibition guests had formed small clusters, their conversations a mix of whispers and furtive glances toward Harold and Johnny. The security guard stood awkwardly by the display case, caught in the gravity of something beyond his pay grade. Johnny turned to Harold. I hope you don't mind me stepping in, just couldn't stand by and watch. Harold shook his head. I never thought I'd be defended by Captain Jack Sparrow. A ghost of a smile crossed his tired face. Though, I must say, your guitar playing in chocolate was pretty decent. Johnny laughed. High praise from Harold Matthews. Marcus returned, his expression a careful mask of professional accommodation. I've spoken with the owner's representative. They've agreed to make an exception, given the unusual circumstances. He raised his hand as Harold's face lit up. With conditions. The guitar cannot leave its display case. Mr. Matthews may touch it, but only while wearing archival gloves, and only for 5 minutes. No playing. Johnny's jaw tightened. You're missing the point entirely. These are the terms, Marcus replied firmly. Take them or leave them. Before Johnny could respond, Harold placed a weathered hand on his arm. It's all right. I'll take it, just to touch her again. The room had gone silent, all pretense of private conversations abandoned as the drama unfolded. Phones were raised again, recording every moment. Marcus produced a pair of white cotton gloves from his pocket. We keep these for handling during transport. He handed them to Harold, who took them with trembling fingers. The security guard stepped aside as Marcus produced a key and carefully unlocked the display case. The hinges made no sound as the glass door swung open. Harold, now wearing the white gloves, stepped forward with the reverence of a man approaching an altar. His breathing was shallow, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The Les Paul gleamed under the exhibition lights, its sunburst finish as vibrant as the day it left the factory in 1959. Harold's gloved fingers hovered over the body of the guitar, trembling slightly. "Hello, old friend," he whispered, so quietly that only those closest could hear. As his fingertips made contact with the wood, a visible shudder passed through his thin frame. Johnny watched, his own eyes suspiciously bright. The guests had drawn closer, phones forgotten, caught in the raw emotion of the moment. Harold's fingers traced the contours of the instrument, lingering over each scratch and dent. "This one was Woodstock," he murmured, touching a small nick near the bridge. "Fell against Keith's drum kit during the finale." His hand moved to a faint stain on the back. "And this?" "This was the night Claire said yes, spilled champagne on both of us." He smiled at the memory. Marcus checked his watch pointedly. 3 minutes left, Mr. Matthews. Johnny shot him a withering look. Harold either didn't hear or chose to ignore the curator. He was lost in reunion, his fingers remembering paths they'd traveled thousands of times before. Then, almost imperceptibly, his expression changed. Decision crystallized in his eyes. Before anyone could react, Harold lifted the guitar from its display cradle. A collective gasp rippled through the room. "Sir!" Marcus's voice rose an octave. "Put that back immediately!" The security guard stepped forward, but Johnny moved between him and Harold. "Wait," he said quietly. "Just wait." Harold cradled the guitar in his arms, his muscle memory adapting instantly to its familiar weight. With deliberate movements, he slipped the strap over his shoulder, the same strap he'd used for years, now replaced with something more befitting a museum piece. "I said no playing," Marcus hissed, but his protest fell on deaf ears. Harold's gloved fingers found the strings, and despite the absence of an amplifier, the first chord rang out with surprising clarity in the hushed room. The opening notes of Midnight Requiem filled the space, hesitant at first, then growing in confidence as Harold's fingers remembered their purpose. Johnny stepped back, giving him room, his expression one of profound respect. The security guard remained frozen, unsure whether to intervene. The exhibition guests stood transfixed, witnessing something that transcended the evening's intended purpose. Harold's eyes were closed now, his face transformed. Gone was the frail old man who'd been dismissed moments earlier. In his place stood an artist reconnected with his instrument, channeling decades of emotion through 6 strings and wood. Even Marcus had fallen silent, his protests dying on his lips as the pure acoustic notes continued to fill the room. The final chord lingered in the air, fading slowly into silence. Harold opened his eyes, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. With gentle hands, he removed the strap from his shoulder and carefully, reverently, placed the guitar back in its cradle. "Thank you," he whispered. To the instrument or to the room, it wasn't clear. "I can go in peace now." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, a single person began to applaud. Others joined, the sound swelling until it filled the grand pavilion. Harold stood before the display case, looking slightly dazed, as if waking from a dream. Johnny placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Marcus closed the display case with shaking hands, his expression unreadable. The applause continued, some guests wiping away tears. The woman who had earlier suggested Johnny buy the guitar stepped forward, removing a tissue from her clutch to dab at her mascara. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "I've had that album for years. I never connected." The older gentleman in the bespoke suit approached Harold. "Mr. Matthews, I must apologize for my earlier comments. What we just witnessed was—" He searched for the right word. Priceless. Marcus cleared his throat. "While this has been a most unexpected turn of events, I must insist that we return to the scheduled program." His voice lacked conviction now, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Johnny stepped forward. "I think Mr. Matthews has given everyone here something far more valuable than what was scheduled," he addressed the room. "You all came here tonight to see legendary instruments. Instead, you witnessed why they became legendary in the first place." The exhibition continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Guests who, moments earlier, had been discussing market values and investment potential now huddled around Harold, asking about the stories behind the music. Phones captured not just the guitars, but the man who had brought one of them to life. Johnny stayed by Harold's side, occasionally filling in details from interviews he'd read, deferring to the older musician with genuine respect. "I should be getting home," Harold said finally, the emotional toll of the evening evident in his voice. "My daughter will be wondering where I am." As Johnny helped him toward the exit, a voice called out, "Mr. Matthews." They turned to see the older gentleman in the bespoke suit hurrying after them. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "My name is Edward Lawrence. I'm the anonymous owner you've heard so much about tonight." Harold blinked in surprise. Johnny's eyebrows rose. "I purchased this collection as an investment, I won't deny it," Lawrence continued, "but after what I witnessed tonight—" He straightened his shoulders. "Mr. Matthews, I would be honored if you would consider becoming a consultant for my collection. To document the stories behind these instruments, to ensure their history isn't lost." His eyes were earnest. "And, of course, to play that Les Paul whenever you wish." 2 weeks later, a video appeared online. It showed an elderly man seated in a comfortable chair, a legendary '59 Les Paul cradled in his lap. "This is the story of how this guitar and I traveled the world together," Harold's voice was clear and strong, "and how, when I thought we'd said our final goodbye, Johnny Depp and an unexpected change of heart brought us back together." The video cut to Johnny, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Harold's chair. "What's remarkable isn't just Harold's music," he explained to the camera. "It's that these instruments only have value because of the people who played them, who poured their souls into them. We've forgotten that somehow." The camera panned to show they were in a recording studio. Edward Lawrence stood in the background, smiling as Harold began to play. The video went viral within hours. Comments poured in from around the world. "This made me cry. Music is about connection, not collection." "Johnny Depp standing up for what matters again." "I'm calling my grandpa right now to hear his stories." By the time Harold Matthews passed away 6 months later, he had recorded one final album on his beloved Les Paul. The exhibition changed its format entirely, featuring video stories from the musicians alongside each instrument. And in the center of it all, a simple plaque read, "Music isn't made by instruments, it's made by people. Harold Matthews, 1944 to 2023. The guitar remained in its display case when not in use, but the case was never locked again.